I'm sorry that. So let me introduce, without further ado, from the Independent California Institute, Dave Marin.
All right, so my name is Dave Marin. I am currently the executive director of the Independent California Institute, which is a 501c3 tax-deductible think tank. It's affiliated with Independent California, which you'll hear from next. I have some handouts to go with this presentation, so I'm going to just pass these around. Take one and pass it, please. So instead of giving a speech, I'm going to tell you about some findings from a study we're in the process of publishing called What It Means to be a Donor State. So you may have heard about California being a donor state, the idea being that we get less spending from the federal government than we pay in federal taxes. And our Attorney General, Javier Becerra, was recently quoted as saying, California is a donor state to the federal treasury. We always, as taxpayers in the state of California, pay more in taxes than we get back to our state. And so we're going to fight where we need to make sure that we get the resources that are provided to the federal treasury. So first of all, are we really a donor state now? This has been studied a lot in the past. There was a more than 20-year study that started it created by a senator from New York, Senator Moynihan, which was called the FISC. The Tax Foundation studied it, but they stopped in 2005. And then there's a few other ones. The most recent one just came out now from the New York Comptroller, but they're kind of like this year, this year, this year. And so we're talking about California independence as a long-term thing, right? So what's our long-term relationship with the federal government? Do we just have some bad years here and there, or is there something structural where we're always losing public dollars to the federal government? And when I talk about years, this is the little fact about the federal budget. They don't use calendar years, they use fiscal years. So fiscal years start in October of the previous year and they go through September. So these are all fiscal year studies. So there was just a study that came out for fiscal year 2018, which actually started in October 2017 and in September 2018. Now you know. So there weren't studies, so it was like, well, let's do our own study, right? How hard can that be? Yeah, it turns out pretty hard. There's a couple things. There's a good deal of federal government data out there, but it's not always quite what you want. Sometimes you want it fiscal year and it's calendar year. Sometimes they have stuff that's kind of close. Sometimes there's data that's tempting, like, oh, if you want to learn about how corporate taxes would be divided up by state, we just look at state corporate taxes, and it's like, no, state corporate taxes are actually all different. A lot of red herrings. So it took over a year. We gathered all our data directly from the federal government, so which means, you don't have to, like, it's their own stuff about how they're screwing us over, and it's copyright free. And there's actually really good data on federal spending on a state-by-state data basis that the federal government itself did through about 2010, and then some nonprofits picked up the ball. It goes through 2015. So this is important. We used spending data that everyone agrees on, and then we added our own revenue data. And because this is a newer study, we're able to build on the methodology of other studies. So one thing we do that's really important is our revenue data follows the same rules as the spending data. So the spending data is just like, did the federal government spend money in the state? It could have been, direct benefits like food stamps. It could have been spending on the military. It could have been some sort of contract. When they do the spending data, they don't care. There's not like good spending or bad spending, direct spending, indirect spending. It's just spending. So revenue sources are the same. And that means, for instance, postal worker salaries are part of the federal budget. They're counted in the spending data that everyone agrees on. Nobody counts postage, USPS revenue. They make billions of dollars from people, buying stamps, mailing things. And it's like, well, if you're going to, if that's going to count in the spending data, then it's also revenue. It's not taxes, but it is revenue. And the other thing that's good about it is a lot of these previous studies have had like a tax incidence model. They're like, who really pays? So, like there's a tax on alcohol, and the tax is collected in the state where the alcohol is produced, but maybe the consumer actually, some of that gets passed on to the consumer. That's cool, but the spending data doesn't work that way, right? If you want to do tax incidence, then you do incidence of benefit. Nobody did that. So And the good thing about this, just looking at where the revenue came from and where it was spent, is you're actually measuring something. And then you're not measuring fairness or subsidy or something like that. You're measuring fiscal independence. Because if more revenue came from a state than went back into it from the federal government, that state could be fiscally independent. That state could have just done everything the federal government did for itself with its own money. So the big question is California really a donor state? And are we always a donor state? And it turns out, first let's look at accounting for federal deficit spending. So these older studies, they said, well, the federal government is almost never running a surplus. It's usually running a deficit. It's usually borrowing money. So that money is not really free, right? Like we are, someone might have to pay for that eventually. So what they say is like, well, the federal government spends more states than it takes in revenue. Let's just scale up that revenue so it's the same size as spending. So everything balances out. So and that's how they account for that. It's very simple. It's kind of easy to argue with, but it's something that's been for a while. So here we go. So if you look at it that way, during this period, this long period of time that went through the George W. Bush administration, the Great Recession, Obama, we got 82 cents back on the dollar for every, and that's a lot of money. That's like more than California's education budget, K-12, community colleges, higher education. All of that's like federal, public dollars just going off into the federal system and never coming back. So, some people aren't into the accounting for deficit. They're like, well, just, how much money comes in, how much goes out. We don't care, borrowing, whatever. Still a donor state. 95 cents on the dollar. And, again, this is including like years of massive deficit spending after the Great Recession. So we could have done all of that. And the only asterisk to, Javier Becerra's always, is there were definitely some years where we were a recipient state. But in 2010, every state was a recipient state. There was so much deficit spending. But averaged over time, we were definitely a donor state. So, we may have this idea of like, oh, as Californians, we are supporting the rest of the country, right? We're helping those poor Americans in other states, and they're depending on us. And that's not great for us, but at least we're doing some good. We're not. If you look, so using this model of absolute donor state, it's like these other states, these recipient states, they're getting a surplus, right? They're getting more federal spending than federal revenue is being collected from them. Where does it come from? 3.2% up there, 3.4% comes from California. We're not even the biggest one. We're behind New York, which is behind New Jersey. But then look at this big red one. That's where it really comes from. Borrowing. So basically, we are always struggling to have enough money for education, for roads, for the environment, for healthcare, and so on. And there are all these other states that are not struggling that way. They're getting extra money in, and we're not even helping them. It's just because the federal government borrows a ton of money. So the good news is we could easily be fiscally independent. In some ways, we already are. And we could have done it not with, we have our own sovereign currency, we have our own sovereign debt, we borrow like the federal government. This is just like, if we had a rainy day fund that kept up with inflation, we could have done all this for ourselves. And not just that, but if you look at how the federal government works, most of federal government is what's called social insurance, like Social Security, right? It's direct payments to individuals. Like any government entity could run Social Security, it would work pretty much exactly the same way. There's a formula. Or it is grants to states, like you've heard of Medicaid, right? It's a federal program. Not really, it's a state-run federal program. Like we call it Medi-Cal. The federal government takes our tax dollars, gives some fraction of them back to us, and then we run a healthcare program, right? Like we don't need the federal government for that. So if anybody asks, is like, well, yeah, what would we do for money? Like, aren't we dependent on the federal government for tax revenue? Aren't we dependent on it for borrowing? Nope. No, it's that bad. It's really just like a leaky bucket. And, sure, there's some borrowing and some surplus spending in bad years, but we could have, if we structure a state government the right way, we could do the exact same thing. So I love questions. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, Hal.
Actually, I did have a question. Coming from Long Beach, were port fees and tariffs weighed into those?
Yes, because the federal government spends money on customs agents. So, and actually, you know, it's a very small part of the federal revenue. It's like 2% or something. But yeah, in California, like a quarter of customs duties during this time. This was before the trade war. That like a quarter of it comes from California. Oh yeah, the other thing that's interesting about this study, this is like sort of like normal United States government, right? This is before the current U.S. president, Ronald somebody. It's just you know, this is Obama and W. Bush. This is just like what the federal government's like in normal times. It still sucks. It's probably worse now. Yes.
How do we calculate overseas spending, like for military bases in Germany or Korea?
We don't. We don't. This is just revenue out of states and revenue into states. And for military bases, for instance, there's international revenue. Some of those countries pay for us to have troops there. Pay for the United States to have troops there.
That would be basically further financed by.
Yeah. It also
deficit spending.
doesn't count service on the debt, and it doesn't count revenue from issuing bonds. So it's just money out of states, money into states.
Oh, that is right. You have questions. Sorry.
Yes, Neil.
Right. So they're taking, depending on which number you use, 5 cents on the dollar or 18 cents on the dollar. I'm inclined to go with the 18 cents because, as you say, somebody's gonna have to pay that back somewhere.
Unless there's inflation, right? Then it just all goes away.
And so they're taking that much out of the California economy, without changing taxes.
Mm-hmm.
Without changing taxes one bit in California.
Mm-hmm.
But in an independent community, that independent nation, that would accrue to California.
That's right.
All right, and so what's the impact on the federal government out of that? Do they have a chance to say, oh, you're taking all this money away from us?
Well, it's the thing. It's not that much money from the federal government's point of view. Like I said, it's really nothing compared to borrowing, and we're not even the largest donor state in absolute terms, even though we're the biggest state and a donor state. Like, really, they need New Jersey. Like, they should be worried about holding on to New Jersey, not California.
All right, that's the last question.
That's
just
the
in
last
terms of
question. All right,
time.
find me during the break, and I'll be happy to have some